Hello, my name's Revd Tim Goodbody. I'm the Diocesan Director of Ordinands. Welcome to St Botolph's Church, Beecham Rodin, a beautiful church in a deep rural setting. We are literally in the middle of a field here. If I'm honest, I have to say that the building is in need of a bit of work. In fact, the first time I came here, a few years ago, there was ivy growing inside the chancel here. Some people might be thinking that not much good could come from a church like this, out in the sticks with a small congregation and dwindling resources. You might be right, but the small, faithful congregation and leadership team here would disagree and would want you to examine your bias. Today's readings from the Epistle of James and Gospel of Mark are both about inclusion, about not showing favouritism or bias. As our society emerges from 18 months of pandemic, there will be an increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots, between those whose jobs survived the lockdown and those who were made redundant, between those who remained untouched by the virus and those who fell ill or even lost loved ones to COVID-19. As society divides, the Church must look to Christ for inspiration, because God's children are, of course, on both sides of the divide. In the 1980 film Brubaker, Robert Redford plays newly appointed prison governor Henry Brubaker. In the opening scenes of that film, we see him arriving at a prison in a bus, apparently a prisoner himself. He is processed with all the new arrivals and experiences firsthand the trauma, favouritism, violence and injustice rife in the prison, before going on to reveal his true identity and begin a programme of redress and reform. I've heard stories of newly appointed church leaders joining their congregations dressed as homeless people, just to see what kind of welcome they receive. If that happened in your church, how would things turn out? Brubaker's opening scenes are a marvellous illustration of the incarnation, of how Christ, though in his very nature God, became a human being, born into poverty and rejection in order to redeem the world. If you want to know why Jesus showed a bias to the poor and the outcast, I think it's partly because that was the life that he lived. But it's also because in the story of God's people in the Old Testament, there are several commands from the Lord to the people, instructing them to welcome the alien, to care for the orphan and the widow, and to grant a jubilee to debtors. These many commands give us a fairly clear idea that God, while he may have a chosen people, the Jews, is from very early on quite enthusiastic, to say the least, about including other people, and specifically other disadvantaged people, in his family. Some say that the reason there are so many commands in the Old Testament to do this is because Israel were not very good at carrying them out. And that would appear to be still the case in the New Testament churches to which James wrote his epistle, the Jewish Christians dispersed across the Mediterranean. The apostle even questions the validity of their faith. Such is their bias in favour of the rich and against the poor. I'm at the stage now of looking for the silver linings in the COVID cloud. And rather strangely, I've concluded that the Anglican financial crisis, combined with the ongoing fallout from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and the frequent exposure of racism within our ranks, all these things could in fact turn out to be just such a silver lining. And if you are puzzled by that remark, let me illustrate. On Saturday the 11th of September at Chelmsford Cathedral, 26 deacons will be ordained and begin their ministry as members of the clergy. They are to become leaders in a church that is very short of cash and which continues to be rocked by scandals around abuse and racism. In short, a church whose credibility is not what it was. The Anglican priest and writer Alan Bartlett, in his book Vicar, addresses this situation when he comments that because of all the church scandals and our consequent loss of credibility in society, the only authentic way for Anglican clergy to lead is from a place of brokenness, humility, and vulnerability. We can no longer expect any sort of preferential treatment just because we bear a bit of plastic in our collar. But why did we ever expect that anyway? To lead from brokenness and with what we might call a credibility overdraft now makes genuine poverty of spirit and humility much more real, because we can only ask forgiveness for the racism and abuse, and we can only commit ourselves to overcoming them. There's no more weathering of the storm. No more go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill. We have to show all the more that our faith is not dead because it is accompanied by works. Jesus provides us, and hopefully also his brother's first readers, with two excellent examples of works of humble inclusion and service in Mark 7. These two little episodes take place outside Jewish territory, in Gentile majority areas. As such, any authority Jesus might have expected to take for granted was diminished. In fact, he is unusual among his contemporary wandering rabbis in choosing to travel the routes which went through these areas. Many Jews avoided them for fear that an inappropriate encounter might render them ritually unclean. But Jesus chooses these places, initially in an attempt to get some peace and quiet in secrecy and seclusion. But then, when that, as ever in Mark's Gospel, proves impossible, he chooses these places and these people, traditionally unclean and to be avoided. He chooses them to demonstrate the values of his Father's kingdom, a sweeping aside of humanity's divisions, an honouring of and blessing of the poor, the healing of the broken, and their consequent reintegration into society. And he does not do this by throwing his weight around, wielding authority in human terms, but instead he does it by intimate engagement with both the Syrophoenician woman and the deaf and dumb man. He got up close and personal with them, and unspectacularly, compared to some episodes like this, he brought them healing and release. Now, these same values are at the heart of the deacon's ministry. And don't forget that those ordained priest and bishop don't hand back their deacon's orders. Last year's deacon's ordinations, which took place under very strict lockdown restrictions, were by necessity a stripped-back affair, with fewer people, less music, no processions, and a lot less finery among the senior clergy in attendance. Afterwards, we received a lot of positive feedback. One person even said, "I've never been before. Is it like this every year?" The simplicity of the event painted a better picture of the ministry of humble, inclusive service to those on the margins than the all-singing, all-dancing, gold chasuble, procession-laden ordinations of the past ever did. We hope that now, in emergence, we have retained by design, rather than necessity, some of that powerful simplicity as those 26 deacons are ordained. Christ, you see, has a bias to the poor because God does. And so we should too. And by we, I mean the church, but especially her ministers. It's time, isn't it, for the church to get down off our high horse before we are permanently knocked to the ground like a slaver statue by any more scandal and sin. It's time for us to roll up our sleeves, to demonstrate that bias, to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and recover the sight of the blind. Jesus told his disciples that the poor would always be with them. That's not a concession to the economy of capitalism, but it is a command to love and serve those who most need our love and service. Here at St. Botolph's, there isn't much fine gold in the vestments, and the processions, when we have them, only last about 20 seconds. It's a very small building. Because we're in the middle of a field, we don't rely on architecture to draw the community's attention to matters of faith. Instead, we rely simply on works of love and service, bringing healing and declaring the good news of God's radical inclusion to those alongside whom we live and work in these rural communities. Come and see us. You would be most welcome, whoever you are.